Good afternoon. If you've just joined us, we're coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg. Welcome to the Weekend Review, the program where we review some of the biggest stories to come out of the week. I'm your host, Mfundo Mabalana. We start here. Authorities have warned motorists of several road closures in Alexandra and Sandton, north of Johannesburg, as the EFF's carnival gets underway. Now, Gauteng Traffic Police say the carnival procession has left the Alexandra Stadium and will arrive at the Mushroom Park in Sandton, where the celebrations will take place at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The carnival is part of several activities in the build-up to the party's 10th anniversary rally to be held at the FNB Stadium next Saturday. All right, let's now bring in independent analyst Sandile Swana just to unpack the Women's League conference that's currently underway. Mr. Swana, good afternoon and thank you very much for your time. Before we actually tackle or take a good look at some of those candidates that are vying for the top job, let's just unpack a little bit that very address by the Secretary General. What stood out for me is this perception that continues to dog the leagues of them perhaps being reduced to proxies of these men within the mother body, that you've got men here that are fighting for positions and you have leagues that are constantly being reduced to their proxies.
Absolutely, Mfundo, and your viewers, thank you so much. You know, the problem, as you correctly point out, is that for many, many years and many conferences before this one, we've been told almost the same story, that the elections must be independent of slates, independent of factions. But when the actual conferences come, even now, you would probably not be blamed for thinking that the RT forces are fielding Bathabile Dlamini, whilst the CR22 or CR24 forces are actually behind Tolashe. So the very idea of slate itself has actually played into the cult of personality, where people don't know politics and people are not involved in politics. They know people. In other words, I'm a Cyril person. I'm a Zuma person. Mm-hmm. And women have been, the Women's League has been a puppet of that show.
Mm-hmm. How dangerous that is, though, that type of a perception, or at least that position where you have these leagues such as the Women's League? Because at this point, many were expecting there to be some sort of vibrancy around women's issues, that we would be seeing the media space littered with articles where we're talking about the issues that continue to plague women today. What kind of a leadership should emerge from the Women's League now that would address some of these issues? But it seems there's been very little of that, but more of what you're talking about of we're now looking to say Bathabile Dlamini is more RET, and then we have Sisisi Tolashe being seen to be CR.
Yes, again, a powerful observation. Probably even if you go to the annals and the records of the United Nations, many detailed declarations, many detailed research reports on the issues of women. Since the 1950s, the women of the ANC came into prominence together with the women of South Africa. But today, even now in this interview, I'm probably going to be discussing personalities, and I may finish this interview without talking about one issue related to women themselves, mm-hmm. because the politics proper of women have been sidelined in the meanwhile.
Mm-hmm. But most certainly in this interview, we'll make sure that the issues of women are actually at the forefront. Let's start then with the internal impact of the Women's League. Since its founding in 1948, one would say in the earlier years, its impact is well documented, but we bring it to now. If we're going to look at the leadership structure, we're seeing that women now are starting to occupy leadership positions, but broadly speaking, that stereotypical gender role fight has not been won completely, because we're still seeing women deputizing. They're not the president or the SG.
Yes, and it matters that a woman, women take the two positions, which is the presidency of the ANC, as well as the Secretary Generalship proper of the ANC. With the clear failings of the government in South Africa, the elected government, especially after the Polokwane conference, it is clear that there is no particular advantage in having a purely male-led NEC nor a purely male-led cabinet. Women, if they want any changes in South Africa, they must take the positions of leadership themselves and not be proxies of any other person. And there are issues that women need to attend to.
You know, ahead of the conference, many women have been asking, what impact can a women's league still have today? And one individual pointed out that we don't see structures specifically for women in the other political parties. Could it be telling that perhaps they never saw the need to push for a structure for specifically women, perhaps in the EFF, because the ANC Women's League didn't necessarily make that much of a meaningful impact that had them wanting to counter their influence in society, that let's rush to also have our own women's league of sorts?
Yes, I don't know the ideological reasons behind not forming a league in the EFF and so on. But what I do know from history, in the same way that, for instance, Stephen Biko in the 1960s going into the 70s said that Black people, it is not enough for you to be represented by white students. At universities, New South was representing all students, white leaders representing Black students as well. And that we must represent ourselves. You cannot think for us. And in the same vein, women, including the ANC Women's League, which is probably the biggest political women's organization in South Africa, need to represent themselves. I think even if I were to consider myself a good man, no matter how good I am, it cannot be my job to represent women to the exclusion of women themselves representing themselves. So that needs attention, and it's urgent attention.
And then if we look at the current feminism wave, we're not looking at just perhaps the overt oppression of suppression of females. Here you've got the subtle oppression of women that, like I stated, they're now in the boardrooms, but somehow there's still the subtle oppression or muzzling of their voice. What kind of a leadership needs to emerge out of that particular conference that will tackle some of these issues that we're seeing young people dealing with?
Yes, I just want to start off with the issue of muzzling. We must accept, it's important to accept, that there is no special advantage in leadership that males have. We do not have extraordinary superior intelligence. White males do not have superior intelligence or skills over anybody else that no woman cannot acquire. So that needs to be put out of the window so that women are legitimate in the boardroom, legitimate in the cabinet and elsewhere. The current problem that needs to be addressed, it doesn't matter whether you are male or female in South Africa in public life today. The one is competence. In other words, if you are leading the Department of Health, know it properly and fully. The other one is high performance. Are you a productive person with a track record of performance? Lastly, are you honest and trustworthy? Those are the three qualities that any leader must have.
So you're saying it should be on merit. But when we have this debate, there are those that say, merit aside, there needs to be a deliberate effort to push women, that yes, they've always been capable. But for instance, let's take it to a profession such as the legal profession. You've got your prominent gentlemen such as your Moses Kakare, your Dalim Pofu, Jeremy Gauntlet, Wim Trengove. I am definitely sure there are female legal professionals who are their equivalents, but they're probably in chambers, not being briefed on the very prominent matters that we're seeing. In that instance, they're capable, but there needs to be a deliberate shift where you have the president saying, I'm going to have a senior counsel that is female leading a Wim Trengove or any other. So don't you think that it not only must be about merit, there needs to just be that deliberate attempt to do this?
Yes, there needs to be an acknowledgement that not only are women equal to men in ability. I was very fortunate in my life that, you know, even at school, amongst the top students, the girls were leading our classes. In as much as we're first-class students ourselves, but the girls were topping the class. So we learn from practice that these girls are capable. But then again, as you correctly point out, there is a need for those who do selection and composition of recruitment committees and so on, nomination committees, to actually make sure that they look deliberately for talented women to put them in position, not to put their puppets into position, to put women who are independent thinkers and who are sensitive to the many social issues that affect women and the youth.
And then to the two candidates now. You've got the former president of the league, that's Meba Tabile Dlamini, and then you've got Sisisi Tolashe, the former SG of the league. Who, according to you, would be equal to the mammoth task ahead?
Well, I perused the CV of Tolashe. And on paper, you may even think that there is a chance that we could be regressing a little bit. And what Batabile Dlamini has done, obviously this dissolution of the Youth Women's League was done under her. And she herself has been found to be a liar in court. So the two candidates, certainly Batabile Dlamini is not ideal. Tolashe, at this desperate hour, probably you would have wanted somebody who's a little bit better, substantially better, in fact, than Tolashe. Tolashe, we will only see the results. I wouldn't actually put my money on Tolashe.
Are you concerned about the age, though, that if maybe there was a desire to rope in younger women, that perhaps you would see greater response post this election, that here you'll have a leadership that perhaps would resonate with younger women in society?
Yes, right now, and in fact, even in the 70s, we had very capable young women who were leading. I mean, in Soweto, during the riots, we saw them, and some of them are still alive. I would have chosen a woman, recommended a woman in her 40s or late 30s, highly educated, with a track record of success in her career, ambitious and results-orientated. That would actually change the game. That would substantially change the game.
Mr. Swana, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. That is independent political analyst Sandile Swana talking to us. More news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us. Our Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be attending the BRICS summit to be held in August. The presidency has revealed in a statement on Wednesday that by mutual agreement, the Russian Federation will be represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, this comes amid the ICC issuing a warrant of arrest against Putin and the expectation that South Africa must arrest and surrender him to the ICC should he land on South African soil. Now, in a brief statement, President Cyril Ramaphosa has confirmed South Africa's readiness to host the historic 15th summit of BRICS nations. It will be the first BRICS summit to be hosted in person since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic.
President Ramaphosa has, over the last couple of months and weeks, held several consultations on South Africa's hosting of the BRICS summit next month. The summit will be attended by the leaders of Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. By mutual agreement between all BRICS member states, President Putin will not be attending the summit. However, Russia will be represented by its foreign minister, Minister Lavrov.
Now, the opposition Democratic Alliance says it wants assurance that Russia's President Vladimir Putin will be arrested regardless of whether or not he comes to the BRICS summit. The opposition had launched a legal battle with a view to force an ICC arrest warrant from government, but the parties eventually settled the matter. Meanwhile, Pretoria hailed as a diplomatic victory that President Vladimir Putin decided not to attend the BRICS summit. We're now joined in studio by distinguished professor and director of the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. That's Professor Patrick Bond. Professor, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me here.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Now, just monitoring this conversation since the announcement, it seems that many have viewed this as a victory for the rule of law, whilst others have said not entirely. If anything else, when we look at this, it's actually given us some sort of a break from having to enforce the law here, that we're going to avoid enforcing it.
Yes, and the other, let's say, political perception is that South Africa has been in a tug of war and at least has emerged without both arms being torn right off. And one arm was being pulled by the West, and not all the West. The United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, but that court judgment way back in February said that Vladimir Putin had been kidnapping, his people had been kidnapping Ukrainian children, and that's a problem that continues to this day. And then the Western powers have been finding different ways to punish South Africa, like threatening the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act's renewal. And this is all about whether South Africa is really neutral. And then on the other side, it was a sign, I think, of some disrespect that President Putin insisted on continuing to be invited and said he would come until late June, when, if you recall, when President Ramaphosa led the African delegation to do the peacekeeping, that was part of the side deal. And there was supposed to be also a side deal around renewing the grain shipments from Ukraine. And that fell apart this week. And, when you saw in Kiev, the Russians continuing to bomb that city, the capital city of Ukraine, while President Ramaphosa was visiting, it looks like South Africa is a very weak player and was lucky to come out from this tug of war intact.
Speaking of weakness, we saw even this week where we had the Kremlin issuing a statement clarifying that, at least from where they stand, there was never this subtle threat to South Africa that should they decide to arrest Vladimir Putin, that would be a declaration of war. Why do you think that is? Why they wanted to add or include this particular position into the current narrative?
Well, I think President Ramaphosa himself put that into his own affidavit. And the dilemma is that, active war or not, we were looking at a constitutional crisis, because there was no way that Ramaphosa, like President Zuma in 2015 when al-Bashir of Sudan visited, no way he would arrest them. And it was a tricky maneuver at the time to get al-Bashir out through Waterkloof Air Base, quickly after the courts had ruled he had to be arrested. And that kind of constitutional crisis between the executive and the judiciary really was looming. And we have very strong human rights lawyers and those Ukrainian supporters who would have wanted to see that crisis unfold in a way that embarrassed Putin. And in a way, they can claim a certain victory, because Putin's failure to come does reflect that the ICC threat is real. And it may then lead to South Africa going through with what Zuma had tried, which was to pull out of the ICC. We'll have to watch that space.
Speaking of pulling out, though, given the crisis, some say it's a self-inflicted crisis, that we have been seized with currently, is it still worth it for South Africa to remain within the ICC when already we would say America has seen our position? They fully understand that there was never an intention, because it was inside that affidavit that should it have come to it, they would have not arrested Vladimir Putin. So is it perhaps an opportune time to relook South Africa's role or membership within the ICC?
Listen, if it raises the question of the ICC's profound hypocrisy in failing to go after, for example, Tony Blair, that would be the sort of most logical potential war criminal for his invasion, with George W. Bush, the U.S. not being a member of the ICC. And the failure to do that is going to always make the ICC look rather farcical. But I would say there are other multilateral bodies that also don't look good. One of them is the BRICS. And the big debate, thank goodness we don't have to debate anymore whether Putin comes or not, but the big debate is its expansion. And what Anil Suklal, our chief diplomat in the BRICS, said, we might have 44 countries that want to join the BRICS. 22 have formally applied. And this is going to be very tricky, because many of them are tyrannies. Many of them are, our next door neighbor, Zimbabwe, utterly bankrupt. Could Zimbabwe join the BRICS Bank with any sense that they would take out loans and repay them? Very interesting problems. The second big dilemma is, would there be a de-dollarization, which the world outside the US dollar zone, the Western powers, would want to see? I would certainly, having worked in the US Federal Reserve, want to see a de-dollarization, because there's too much power and abuse of power. It's not just the sanctions, the SWIFT system that meant Russia has been financially very disadvantaged in just doing deals.
I want to take you, apologies for interjecting, I just want to take you to that just main point you make around Zimbabwe. That here, if we're going to look at GDPs, it's been something that we were criticized of at the beginning, that what is our real impact ourselves as South Africa within BRICS? And many said, at the very least, we still hold the position of being the gateway to the continent. That was perhaps the power or influence that we came with. But realistically speaking, we're still insofar as our GDP is concerned, we're still a small player. So shouldn't they honestly just open it up nevertheless if they opened it up to us?
Well, it depends on what the BRICS could be and should be. And one of them would be whether it could be an alternative source of financial and currency and monetary relationships that wouldn't rely upon everything around the US dollar and the US Federal Reserve. But I do think if you consider Egypt and Nigeria, the two bigger countries and more populous countries than South Africa, those would be logical members. And they've been proposed as the next wave of BRICS entries. But it's really the big ones, Saudi Arabia, a very close US ally until roughly a year or so ago. And Saudi Arabia doing a deal with its regional enemy, Iran, thanks to China earlier this year, and Iran also wanting to be in the BRICS, and the UAE and Bahrain and Kazakhstan. So some major oil-based tyrannies. One would add to that major countries like Turkey, Afghanistan and Indonesia and Thailand, and Argentina is pretty sure to be entered, maybe Mexico, Venezuela, lots of very interesting countries, Senegal and Algeria also from Africa. So these are the countries that have come up as the sort of first logical wave. And I hope there can be some attention. What would be the criteria? Anil Sukla said, well, that will become more and more evident. They're still negotiating that. And maybe by August 22nd to 24th, we'll know more. And then we'll know more whether there are, for the major crises of the world, the climate catastrophe, the world's worst weather now being recorded, or the food crisis that's worsened now because of the Russian decision not to allow Ukrainian grain out, or the energy crises that continue. These are where one would hope the BRICS would offer a genuine alternative to multilateralism. But
there's another important gathering just before BRICS. We're going to have the Russia-Africa summit. What we saw, what I was getting at in my question when I asked the decision to insert their position that we never were subtly threatening South Africa, that if they arrest Vladimir Putin, it would be a declaration of war. Do you perhaps think adding that position into the current discourse was perhaps to sort of deal with any tensions ahead of that Africa-Russia summit here, to say that we come as a equal onto the continent, looking to work with all of you? We in no way would seek to sort of bully or privately bully such a strategic partner as South Africa.
It is interesting because, it was 2019 that Putin had hosted the African leaders the last time, and things are very, very different. And the tensions around especially food imports and the energy crises will, I'm sure, make some of the Africans that are coming there at least quietly lobby for Putin to change posture, and maybe to try to deal with the end of potential end to this terrible war and the invasion of Ukraine. Now, the dilemma is that when we do see President Ramaphosa go to Moscow on the 26th of this month, and we see maybe 36 or so African leaders, they won't have a unified position. There isn't sort of an AU standpoint, and this sort of neutrality, and some are abstaining and some are voting against Russia in the UN, makes it a bit of a confused mess. The only real Russian interests in Africa that begin to contend with, say, China, which is FOCAC, the big forum on China-Africa cooperation, or India or Japan or the US and Europe. So those are the big sort of bilaterals between Africa and other major players. Would be the question of the Wagner Group and its control of several countries, the Central African Republic, its role in the Sudan War, the question of Rosatom trying to push nuclear energy, and then, as I say, the fertilizer and grain and energy deals that have been thrown into disarray.
Just in closing, what is more desirable here when it comes to Africa? Should we be speaking in one voice, or it really speaks to our independence as different countries, that here you're allowed to have a stance of we are non-aligned, and those that are aligned that would say, actually, you need to condemn Russia, and others that would say, no, we actually need to condemn the USA for their role, or the European Union for their role in what we're seeing in Russia versus Ukraine?
Yeah, and just to remind, that condemnation of the West stems from the United States and the NATO powers breaking the promise back in the early 90s not to move eastward.
Eastward,
and that's
yes, the Warsaw Pact, yes.
Not a justification for this terrible invasion, but a background context. Now, if Africa can take up that mantle of leading a non-aligned voice genuinely, that would be marvelous, because it would say to the world, let's have a conscience, and the collateral damage, the debt crises, the economic and food and energy crises that have emerged, the climate catastrophe that's not being addressed, all of those are adversely affecting Africa, and it's vital for Africans to be critical of everyone in all of this. However, there are maneuvers, and there's a Cold War, in a sense, emerging.
But we're being criticized, Professor, particularly South Africa, on this non-aligned stance. That can we really, as South Africa, afford to be on the fence at this particular time? Because us as a country, we are recipients of the goodwill of others or their moral clarity on apartheid being wrong. They took a decision. That can we as South Africans afford to be on the fence when you have such a matter?
Well, it's interesting. As you say, the West, and particularly it was the US and Europe, especially England, Germany, were led by right-wing governments that were pro-apartheid effectively in the 1980s. And so we can never forget that. And the USSR had supported the liberation movement when it was a very different country than it is now. So yeah, those are interesting historical aspects. But I would say, yeah, we have to be able to afford the honesty, the integrity, the reminder of President Mandela's evocation of human rights in foreign policy, and not play geopolitical games the way I think we are now. And as I said, we're looking like being pulled by both sides and barely surviving without losing our arms.
Professor, an insightful conversation, was certainly one that needs perhaps an hour, but thank you very much for indulging us and coming through to the show.
Thanks,
that is Professor Patrick Bond. More news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Now, officials of the city of Johannesburg say they've detected an old gas pipe which is still active and runs below the city centre. They say work will be undertaken to shut it off. Now, this follows Wednesday's blast, which ripped through parts of Lillian Ngoyi Street, formerly known as Bree. One person was killed and 48 others injured. 3 of the injured are still in hospital.
Johannesburg City Manager confirmed that the Wednesday evening explosion was caused by gas. However, the city cannot confirm the source and type of gas. The buildings around the epicenter of the blast have also been found to be structurally sound. This amid concerns that the cracks and sinkhole along the road may be getting wider.
When we look at the question of the cracks, the buildings itself are basically all piled and the foundations are deep down. They're totally unaffected by the explosion in the center of the road.
The city has warned that the tunnel below the affected areas in the Johannesburg CBD may be at risk of collapsing, and residents are advised to stay away from barricaded areas.
Our EMS teams, they have completed an assessment between the Lillian and Ngoyi and Loveday streets. However, it was discovered that the tunnel has got some form of structural integrity and is deformed and not stable and may collapse at any given time as a result of the movement of crossing of the road, specifically towards the CJ Cronje building.
Only 3 of the 48 people who were receiving medical attention at various hospitals for injuries remain in hospital. Mbalenhle Mthethwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
State witness Zandile Khumalo has denied that an altercation between herself and her then-boyfriend Longe Twala resulted in soccer star Senzo Meyiwa being shot dead back in 2014. The defense said a witness would be called who will testify that Meyiwa's friend Tumelo Mahlala told that witness that the deceased was hit by a bullet while trying to intervene in a fight between Khumalo and Twala. But the state objected to that line of questioning. Kelly Khumalo and Meyiwa's relationship also came under scrutiny in the Pretoria High Court.
Zandi Khumalo denies that there was a fight with her boyfriend on the night that Meyiwa was killed.
This witness basically would come and tell this court, because the state is going to call him, will come and tell this court that on the date of the happening of this incident, he got a call from your sister Kelly.
Lo fakazi uzoza ke azotshela ke ngoba bazombiza ke azotshela inkantolo ukuthi ngelanga ekwenzeka ngaso isigameko lesi wathola ke ucingo olubuya udadewenu uKelly.
Unfortunately, as she tried to explain what was happening, there was a conversation breakdown. When they tried to call her back, they couldn't reach her.
Ngeshwa ke esachaza ke noma esazama ukuthi achaze ukuthi kwenzakalani kwase kukhona nje ukunqamuka ke kwinkulumo leyo yabo uma esezama ke ukuthi abuyele kuyena ke akazange amthole.
Subsequent, they then phoned Tumelo Madlala.
Base ke emuva kwalokho ke befonela yena uTumelo Madlala.
And Tumelo Madlala informed him, now this witness whose identity we will not disclose.
Waseke uTumelo etshela lofakazi lona engithi ke igama lakhe alichaziwe.
That Senzo has been hit by a bullet.
Ukuthi ke uSenzo ushaywe inhlamvu.
And this happened as Senzo was trying to intervene or separate a fight that was happening between yourself and Longwe.
Firstly, Longwe and myself were not fighting.
We were in a very good space.
We were very happy, myself and Longwe. We were in a very good space. For me to have invited him to come to my home, yes. That explains that myself and him, things were good between the two of us.
Yes.
So
So that which is being said now, I know nothing about.
Khumalo was also questioned on a statement by Twala, who described one of the intruders as light-skinned, in contrast to the description she gave.
He says, in his latest statement, I noticed two guys getting inside the house. The one who came first was short, dark, having dreadlocks with cheekbones.
Utilana ke kulesi sinye sifundayo ke manje statement ngabona ke amadoda amabili amnyama engena endlini lona ke owayephambili ke noma oqala ke wayemfishane dark ka eneqhomo
and was
noma dreadlocks.
And he was wearing a jacket that was between khaki or light brown in bracket beige.
Koke ke i-jacket eyayingakhaki light brown noma beige.
He says he cannot remember his other clothing.
Okunye awayegqokile athi akakhumbuli.
He was followed by immediately a tall one followed.
Waseke elandelwa omude.
He was wearing black hoodie.
Fake hoodie emnyama.
He was light in complexion.
Light noma ke ekhanya ngebala.
That is to say, he still emphasizes that the second suspect who got into the house was light in complexion.
Sonke singabona into eyodwa kodwa si experience ngendlela ezihlukahlukene futhi eziningi.
We can all see the same thing, but experience it in different ways and many ways.
Maywa and his then girlfriend Kelly Khumalo's relationship was also thrust into the spotlight. SMSs Kelly sent to Zandi point to Kelly contemplating leaving the relationship.
I'll read the one in the middle of the page. I'm emotionally drained. I sometimes feel that Senzo brought a dark cloud in my life. And I can almost hate myself for not succeeding in getting rid of him via SMSs, and the SMS would not go. I feel like God is deliberately sabotaging me by keeping this man in my life.
Njengoba sengishilo ukuthi angazi ukuthi ezinye izinto angizazi ukuthi zazenzeka nini kanjani, but engikwazi ukuthi kwakuyi back and forth phakathi kwabo bobathathu. and uKelly wayemthanda okwangempela uSenzo noSenzo futhi wayemthanda uKelly ngokubona kwami.
As I've already said that I don't know as to when and how certain things were happening, but it was a back and forth between the three of them, and Kelly loved Senzo and Senzo loved Kelly according to how or what I saw.
Futhi kwakungamphathi kahle uKelly ukuthi uSenzo akakwazi ukukhetha noma akanalo iqiniselana.
And it wasn't sitting well with Kelly that Senzo wasn't in a position to choose, or that he didn't have enough honesty.
Cross-examination will continue on Monday.
Let's shift our focus to this story now. Some welcome news for indebted consumers. The amount of debt repayment will remain the same. This is after the Reserve Bank kept the repo rate unchanged at 8.25%. The prime lending rate, that's the benchmark rate at which banks charge their clients when borrowing money, remains at 11.75%. It's the first pause in rates since late 2021.
The consecutive moderations in consumer inflation seem to have influenced the Reserve Bank's latest decision to keep the repo rate unchanged. But this is not about to change the current high interest rate environment, as risks to inflation remain on the upside. Local food price inflation is still high at 11%, and there are risks of drier weather conditions in coming months. The Reserve Bank says the electricity crisis also poses inflation risks. It says the load shedding and logistics constraints have broader effects on doing business and the cost of living. The central bank has revised downwards slightly its inflation forecast for this year to 6% from 6.2% earlier. It expects inflation to average 5% next year and to reach the midpoint of the target bracket in 2025.
The Monetary Policy Committee decided to keep the repurchase rate at the current level of 8.25%. 3 members of the committee preferred to keep rates on hold, and 2 preferred an increase of 25 basis points. At the current repurchase rate level, policy is restrictive, consistent with still high inflation expectations and the outlook. Serious upside risks to the inflation outlook remain.
Economists say the current high interest rate levels will be with us for some time due to the elevated inflation expectations. It's expected South Africans could see a cut in interest rates only towards the end of next year.
As long as inflation risks remain firmly tilted to the upside, we are likely to see interest rates at a higher level for longer. And so based on that view, my assumption is that we actually get the first interest rate cut, as you say, a bit later, so maybe the second quarter or even the third quarter of next year.
The Reserve Bank expects the local economy to grow at 0.4% this year, slightly higher than its previous expectation of 0.3%. The central bank says the energy and logistics constraint remain a challenge to the growth outlook, limiting economic activity and increasing costs. Gloria Sefakomusi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
President Cyril Ramaphosa says the 2 life-size statues unveiled in Mthatha and Qunu in honor of former President Nelson Mandela are a recognition of Madiba's efforts to change the lives of his people and hope to those who are still marginalized. Now, he was speaking at the unveiling of the 3.3 million rand monuments at Madiba's birthplace. Some community members have decried the use of money, saying it could have been better spent to create jobs and change the face of their municipality for the better. The CEO of the Nelson Mandela Museum, Vuyani Boy, says these statues are a symbolic representation of the former statesman's struggle and achievements. Boy says South Africa has a right to celebrate the achievements and sacrifices of Nelson Mandela. He was responding to questions being raised about the cost and if that money could not have been utilized better. And that's where we leave it for today. Have a wonderful day further. See you tomorrow.